Welcome to Apologetics from the Attic, the show that seeks to teach and defend the Christian faith in a post-Christian culture. And now, broadcasting from an attic in an undisclosed location somewhere outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, here is your host, Dave Lewis.
Hey everyone, welcome to another edition of Apologetics from the Attic. And we're going to continue with part 4 of our series on the biblical theology of the Penal Substitutionary Atonement. If you found me on YouTube, you can go ahead and subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or all the other major podcast platforms. I post the audio of these there as well for your convenience. And if you found me on any of those, I also have a YouTube channel. I'd appreciate you subscribe there. All right, so let's just jump right in. We're in Numbers. This is part 4. Last time we did Leviticus. We've done Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and now we're on to the book of Numbers. So let's jump right in for sake of time. So Numbers starts with a census where we get the listing of the Israelites. And first thing I want to take a look at that deals with the atonement is verse 51. So they talk about setting up the tabernacle because remember, there's about to be 40 years of wilderness wandering. So we're going to see that story in Numbers where they rebel against the Lord and refuse to go into the promised land. But this tabernacle is going to be essential for when the Israelites are moving about in the wilderness. And verse 51, chapter 1 says, so when the tabernacle is to move on, the Levite shall take it down, and when the tabernacle encamps, the Levite shall set it up. But the layman who comes near it shall be put to death. So just to emphasize this goes on and on. This theme reappears over and over again in Leviticus and again in Numbers, that the tabernacle that is set up and even the items in the tabernacle cannot be touched by anyone but the Levites, and even among the Levites, there's layers of who can touch what because of the holiness of God. So remember, we have the holy presence of the Lord moving about with the Israelites, and this holy presence cannot be toyed with, it cannot be touched because God's wrath will break out against the individual and they will die. And then 53, but the Levites shall camp around the tabernacle of testimony so that there will be no divine wrath against the congregation of the sons of Israel. So the Levites shall be responsible for service to the tabernacle of testimony. So notice, the reason why the Levites are there is because of the divine wrath. And this is the threat. Remember, we're asking the question still, how can a holy God dwell amongst a sinful, unclean people without his holy divine wrath breaking out against them? And the answer, of course, is the Levitical priesthood, the sacrifices, the tabernacle, and what happens there. But what's interesting about the book of Numbers, and we'll see this, is even though the tabernacle is once again mentioned and is going to be set up, we're going to see that a lot of the atonement language and the intercession between God and his people will take place outside of when the tabernacle is set up. We're going to see that. And I think that's very determinative for how we understand the atonement and the types and shadows that lead to Jesus Christ in the New Testament. So let's move to chapter 3. So we got Numbers 1, 2, the arrangement of the camps. So there's a detailed instruction on where each tribe should camp when the tabernacle is set up in the wilderness. Now we have 3, 2 to 4. Now I just wanted to point out this. These are the names of the sons of Aaron: Nadab, the firstborn, and Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. These are the names of the sons of Aaron, the appointed priests, whom he ordained to serve as priests. But Nadab and Abihu died in the presence of the Lord when they offered strange fire before the Lord in the wilderness of Sinai, and they had no children. So Eleazar and Ithamar served as priests in the lifetime of their father Aaron. I just want to point out, can you imagine Aaron having to serve as the high priest, and that memory of his sons being killed by the wrath of God because they offered the unauthorized strange fire? That must have haunted him his entire life. So Aaron has to approach this holy God, the holy God who slayed his own 2 sons. I just thought that's an interesting thing to think about. What would have been going through Aaron's mind as he performed his priestly duties, knowing, remembering that. And in verse 11, I think is interesting. A lot of these ceremonies, a lot of these instructions that God sets up is reminding the people of the Passover, reminding them of what God did for them. And how is that? Well, verse 11, chapter 3, again, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Now, behold, I have taken the Levites from among the sons of Israel instead of every firstborn, the firstborn of the womb among the sons of Israel. So the Levites shall be mine. For all the firstborn are mine. On the day that I fatally struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, I sanctified to myself all the firstborn of Israel. From the human firstborn to animals, they shall be mine. I am the Lord. So this idea that the firstborn all belong to the Lord, what's the purpose of it? To remind the Israelites about what he did in Egypt and delivering them from Egypt. The Passover is so determinative and always in the background of everything going on here. And you'll see that. Now, 4:15 is our next text we want to look at here. There's a lot of numbers. I hope I can get through this whole thing in an hour. So then we have, or 4:15. And I just want to, just the idea of touching the holy thing. So there's these detailed instructions about who carries what when the tabernacle is moved. And it says, when Aaron and his sons have finished covering the holy objects and all the furnishings of the sanctuary, when the camp is to set out, after that, the sons of Kohath shall come to carry them by poles so that they will not touch the holy objects and die. These are the things intended being the sons of Kohath are to carry. And then it gives so all the things, so when the tabernacle is torn down because God's presence is moving, there's a certain way they have to package up everything and transport it. And they have to use poles. They can't actually touch the holy things because if they do, they die. And we see that in the book of Samuel, where someone tries to steady the Ark of the Covenant because it's about to fall off the cart, and they touch it and they die. Sorry, I still got this cough that's lingering. It's driving me crazy. And then we got 4:22. Is that it? I can't read my own writing here. Or is it 20? But yeah, same thing. They shall not come in to see the holy objects, even for a moment, or they will die. So you can't even look upon the holy objects. They all get covered. If you even look upon them, you'll die. Just another thing to emphasize, the wrath of God, the holiness of God. And then we have chapter 5. This is all the setup for what happens. And then we have the defilement. And it's just, the camp must be pure. Command the sons of Israel that they send away from the camp everyone with leprosy, everyone having a discharge, and everyone who is unclean because of contact with a dead person. You shall send away both male and female. You shall send them outside the camp so they do not defile the camp where they dwell in their midst. So this ritual purity, once again, reminding us that within the presence of God, nothing of the curse can dwell in his midst because he is holy. Just point that out. And then we have 6:22, very, very important text. Many of you know this, the priestly blessing. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron and his sons, saying, In this way you shall bless the sons of Israel. You are to say to them, The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord cause his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his face upon you and give you peace. So they shall invoke my name on the sons of Israel, and then I will bless them. So this blessing of the Lord, and what's the blessing include? His face shine upon you, and his grace be upon you, and his face and peace be upon them, his gaze. I remember years ago, it stuck with me, Paul Washer, he has a lot of good stuff on the Penal Substitutionary Atonement and how Christ bore the curse on the cross. And I remember he said, well, what Jesus endured on the cross was the opposite of this. The Lord curse you. The Lord abandon you. The Lord cause his face to turn from you. The Lord cause his wrath to fall upon you. The Lord turn his face from you and give you, the opposite of peace. What? Disorder, war. That's what Christ endured on the cross. I remember it was a very good thing he said. So then we have chapter 7. And this is where to help with the setup of the tabernacle, the construction of it, it gives a whole listing of who gave what, silver dishes and gold pans and all this stuff. And I just think it's interesting that what's contrasted here, I think, is you had the golden calf incident where these gold, the earrings and the gold is given to Aaron in order to construct the golden calf. Now we have the gold given by the people to serve in the worshiping of the Lord. And I think that's an important contrast the text wants us to see. Then we have 8. What is this? The Levites in place of the firstborn. We already went over that. We can skip that. Chapter 8 also just reiterates the idea of the Levites, the firstborn. Then we have chapter 9, the Passover. Now, here's something I want you to see that I think this is an interesting thing that I never really put together. Now, the Lord spoke to Moses. This is chapter 9, verse 1 in Numbers. The Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the first month of the second year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, now the sons of Israel to celebrate the Passover at its appointed time. So it goes through that. Okay, so here's what happens. So there's this instance where there were some men of Israel, because they had contact with a dead person, they could not celebrate the Passover that night, and they came before Moses and Aaron on that day. And then Moses said, wait and listen. So they're basically asking, though we are unclean because of a dead person, why are we kept from presenting the offering of the Lord at this appointed time among the sons of Israel? So they're forbidden because they're following what God said. If you've had contact with a dead body, you have to be placed outside the camp. And Moses said he's going to speak to the Lord about that. But look what it says here. So what's the Lord's answer if these unclean who contacted a dead body can celebrate Passover? The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, if any one of you or your generations becomes unclean because of a dead person, or is on a distant journey, he may, however, celebrate the Passover of the Lord. Now, I find that very interesting. Because remember in the Gospels, it was said that the high priests and the Sanhedrin, who were, putting Jesus under false charges and trying to get him executed, they didn't want to enter the palace where Pilate was because they didn't want to be unclean for the Passover. Well, according to this, they wouldn't have been unclean if I'm correct. So that's quite interesting. So they can still celebrate the Passover. But the person who is clean and not on a journey yet refrains from celebrating the Passover, that person shall be cut off from his people because he did not present the offering. That person will bear responsibility. Now look at this one, 8:14. And if a stranger resides among you and celebrates the Passover to the Lord, according to the statute of the Passover and its ordinance, he shall celebrate it. You shall have the same statute both for the stranger and for the native of the land. So the Passover is for non-Israelites as well. And if you've ever thought about it, when you read the Gospels, you have the book of Hebrews, which really places the work of Christ in the context of the temple, right? And the sacrifices and the high priest, which is very important to understand. But in the Gospels, you don't have that. I mean, apart from Jesus saying, destroy this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days, speaking of his body, there isn't a lot of language, interestingly, where Jesus intentionally sets the temple worship as the context of his sacrifice on the cross. He really doesn't. And we read through it. There's not a lot of that. But what does Jesus explicitly place as the background and understanding of his sacrifice? The Passover. So it's quite interesting that, and I think that it might be because the Passover is explicitly stated to be for the Jew and the non-Jew. And I also think that the book of Numbers really sets the Passover as this central, feast of celebrating the Lord. It almost has equal weight to the temple sacrifices. So it's quite interesting. So I just want to point that out. And then we have 11. Okay. So remember in Exodus, then we have the trumpets. We're skipping a lot. Grab another cough drop real quick so I can keep this cough at bay till this video's done. So if you remember in Exodus, after they left Egypt, crossed the Red Sea, and we kind of skipped these. We went right to Mount Sinai, but between the Red Sea and Mount Sinai, there are several stories of the people complaining and against the Lord and saying we don't have water, we don't have food, etc., etc. And the Lord, deals with that. But that's really the only two. There's only a couple stories there, and then we get into Sinai, and then we have the golden calf incident, and that's pretty much takes you through Exodus. But here, we really have a whole set of stories where the people are wandering in the wilderness and how God deals with their complaining and his wrath comes out against them and their sin. And this becomes determinative, I think, and you're going to see what it builds up to when we look at the meaning of atonement and penal substitutionary atonement in particular. Now, chapter 11. Now the people became like those who complain of adversity in the ears of the Lord. And the Lord heard them, and his anger was kindled. And the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some at the outskirts of the camp. Oh, and if you're wondering, I'm using the New American Standard Bible, just if you're wondering what the translation is. It's just a more literal translation. So when you're doing study, it's better to use a literal translation. Anyway, so they complained. And what happened? What happens when they complain? And this is this language of God's wrath. His anger was kindled. So if you kindle a fire, right, it starts to burn. And the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some at the outskirts. Then the people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died out. So that place name was Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burned among them. It's quite interesting, right? So once again, we have the intercession of Moses. The patriarchal blessing theme continues, where intercession can be made, and it can turn God's wrath. And it's the fire dies out. Why? Because Moses prayed to the Lord. So we have this typology that continues to be developed of Moses, the intercessor, pleading to the Lord for his people, that they won't suffer wrath. Verse 4, now the rabble who were among them had greedy cravings, and the sons of Israel also wept again and said, who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish which we used to eat for free in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. But now our appetite is gone. There is nothing to look at except this manna. So then the people start complaining about the manna that God's providing for them on a daily basis. And they want meat. Now Moses heard the people weeping throughout their families. Each one was at the entrance of his tent, and the anger of the Lord became very hot. And Moses was displeased. So Moses said to the Lord, why have you been so hard on your servant? Why have I not found favor in your sight? You have put the burden of all this people on me. Was it I who conceived this people, or did I give birth to them? You shall say to me, carry them in your arms and nurse, as a nurse carries a nursing infant in the land which you swore to your fathers. Where am I to go to get meat to give all these people? For they weep before me, saying, give us meat, so that we may eat. I'm not able to carry all this people by myself, because it is too burdensome for me. So if you're going to deal with me this way, please kill me now, for I have found favor in your sight, and do not let me see my misery. So Moses is getting frustrated with leading the people and all their complaining. And we're going to see this manifest itself later. This is this inner attitude of Moses is coming out. It actually disqualifies him from entering the promised land later on. And I believe this is the foundation of it. And then this is where the Lord, in response to Moses' cry, lets him appoint 70 elders of Israel. And the burden can be shared with them, by them, with Moses. Bear one another's burdens, as Paul says. So we get the 70. I will come down and speak with you there, and I will take away some of the spirit who is upon you and put him on them. And they shall bear the burden of the people with you, so that you will not bear it by yourself. So the spirit's going to be placed on these 70 elders. And you shall say to the people, consecrate yourself tomorrow, and you shall eat meat. For you have wept in the ears of the Lord, saying, oh, that someone would give us meat to eat, for we were well off in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you meat to eat, and you shall eat. You shall eat not 1 day, not 2 days, not 5 days, nor 10 days, not 20 days, but for a whole month, till it comes out of your nose and makes you nauseated, because you have rejected the Lord who is among you, and have wept before him, saying, why did we ever leave Egypt? But Moses said, the people among whom I am included are 600,000 on foot, yet you have said, I will give them meat, so they may eat for a whole month. Our flocks and herds will be slaughtered for them, so it will be sufficient for them, or all the fish of the sea to be caught for them, so that it will be sufficient for them. Then the Lord said to Moses, is the Lord's power too little? Now you shall see whether my word will come true for you or not. So God's going to say, hey, I'll give you meat. The spiritual lesson here is be careful what you ask for, because you just might get it. And we're going to see what happens when they get this meat. Then Moses is questioning, just like the disciples did to Jesus, right? Where are we going to get enough bread to feed all these people? Moses is like, there's 600,000 people. How are we going to get meat for them? And God's basically like, well, you'll see. So Moses went out and told the people the words of the Lord. He also gathered 70 men of the elders of the people and positioned them around the tent. Then the Lord came down in the cloud and spoke to him and took away some of the spirit who was upon him and placed him upon the 70 elders. And when the Spirit rested upon them, they prophesied, yet they did not do it again. So interesting, right? We have the activity of the Holy Spirit noted here, where it's placed upon the 70. But 2 men had remained in the camp, the name of whom one who was Eldad, the name of the other Medad. And the Spirit rested upon them, and they were among those who had been registered but had not gone out to the tent. Yet they prophesied in the camp. So a young man ran to inform Moses and said, Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp. Then Joshua, son of Nun, the personal servant of Moses, arose from his youth, responded and said, My Lord Moses, restrain them. But Moses said, Are you jealous for my sake? If only all the Lord's people were prophets, and the Lord would put his Spirit upon all of them. Then Moses returned to the camp, both he and the elders of Israel. That's an interesting little story. It's always fascinating me. Why is it even in there? Because you have these 2 who weren't with the 70, yet they still prophesied. And Moses' response is, would that all the Lord's people were prophets, and he will put his Spirit upon them. Well, that's quite interesting, right? Is that a new covenant fulfillment? We set aside the prophet thing, and that's a controversial thing. Are there modern day prophets? But certainly we're all prophets in the sense of declaring and speaking forth the word of the Lord, his written word, his gospel message. In the new covenant, of course, the Spirit is given to all who trust in Christ. Now we have this. So what happens after this? Well, the promise of God to give meat is fulfilled. Now wind burst forth from the Lord, and it brought quail from the sea, and dropped them beside the camp, about a day's journey on this side, and a day's journey on that side, and the other side, all around the camp, and about 2 cubits deep on the surface of the ground. What's 2 cubits? X. About 3 feet. So, how many quail is that? So you got however long you could walk in a day on all around the camp, that entire square miles it would have been around the camp, and 3 foot deep of quail. Unbelievable. And so once these quails all are, pulled in from the sea, all the people spent all day, all night, all the next day and gathered the quail. The one who gathered least gathered 10 homers. How much is that? 77 cubic feet. So there were people that gathered more, but the least amount was 77 cubic feet of quail. So man, they gathered a lot. They were going to feast. But look what it says. And they spread themselves out. So while the meat was still between their teeth before it was chewed, the anger of the Lord was kindled against the people, and the Lord struck the people with a very severe plague. So well, the meat was still between their teeth before it was chewed. So as they're taking their first bite, God sends a plague. Because this is a very serious sin against the Lord. You're not trusting his daily provision. You want to gather all this meat for yourself so you can have it and feel secure that you don't have to gather your daily bread. You can gather up all this meat. So it's really being unfaithful to the Lord and not trusting in him, and being sick, not thanking him for his provision. So it's really unbelief at the core. So a place was named Kibroth Hatava, because there they buried the people who had been greedy. And it's interesting, there's no intercession here, is there? There's not a bit of intercession from Moses or anyone. This plague just breaks out, and it kills lots of people, and they buried them there. Now, and I want you to notice the wrath of God. This is outside of the tabernacle. This is in the camp itself. Okay, so then we have 11. Or is that where we were? That's where we were. Okay, craving meat. Okay, let's go to 12 now. Numbers 12. So we're still just seeing all these stories of the wrath of God breaks out against sin. Now remember, those who deny penal substitutionary atonement, one of their foundational things is they want to view all these stories of the wrath of God breaking out against people as not, this is what I think it plainly says, God's active, personal sending of wrath, which kills people, to more of a passive thing God set in place that's simply the natural consequences of sin, and God doesn't have any direct involvement in bringing those consequences. And I think the text is pretty clear that option B is not what the Bible teaches. But now, then we have the murmuring of Miriam and Aaron. So now we have these leadership challenges against Moses' leadership. So Numbers 12. Then Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman he had married, he had married a Cushite woman. And they said, "Is it a fact that the Lord has spoken only through Moses? He has not spoken through us as well?" And the Lord heard this. Now the man Moses was very humble, more than any person who was on the face of the earth. Now this has always been a funny thing. You know, Moses wrote the Pentateuch, and Moses writes in there he was the most humble person on the face of the earth. Would a humble person write they were humble? Well, apparently they can. And the Lord suddenly said to Moses and Aaron and Miriam, "You three go out to the tent of meeting." So the three of them went out, and the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the entrance of the tent, and he called Aaron and Miriam. When they had both come forward, he said, "Now hear my words. If there's a prophet among you, I, the Lord, will make myself known to him in a vision. I will speak with him in a dream. It is not this way for my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my household. When I speak mouth to mouth, that is openly and not using mysterious language, and he beholds the form of the Lord. So why are you not afraid to speak against my servant, against Moses?" And the anger of the Lord burned against them, and he departed. But when the cloud had withdrawn from above the tent, behold, Miriam was leprous, as white as snow, and Aaron turned toward Miriam, behold, she was leprous. And Aaron said to Moses, "O my Lord, I beg you, do not hold us responsible for this sin by which we have turned out to be foolish and by which we have sinned. Oh, do not let her be like a dead person whose flesh is half eaten away when he comes out of his mother's womb." So Moses cried to the Lord, saying, "God, heal her, please." But the Lord said to Moses, "If her father had only spit in her face, would she not be put to shame for 7 days? Have her shut outside the camp for 7 days, and afterwards she may be received again." So Miriam was shut out outside the camp for 7 days, and the people did not move on until Miriam was received again. Interesting. So the Lord basically responds to Aaron and Miriam's challenge of Moses' leadership. Moses is my unique leader. I speak to him face to face. How dare you challenge his authority, basically. And then when his presence leaves the situation, Miriam is head to toe with leprosy. Now notice, it doesn't say that she was healed of her leprosy. So it may be reasonable to conclude that she had this leprosy for the rest of her life as a reminder not to challenge the authority of the one that God has put in charge. And notice God's wrath can be manifested in the giving of disease, in this case, leprosy. And then we have chapters 13 and 14, and we're not going to go through this, but it's important to read because you have the spies that go into the land, and then they go in and spy out the land. They bring back some of the first fruits. That's where we get that. That language comes back in the New Testament. Christ is the first fruits. They bring some of the fruits of the land, and they bring them back into the wilderness so that people can eat them. But of course, the spies come back, and 10 of them are very negative, and we can never take this land. There's giants in there. These people are strong, and they're fortified. There's no way we can beat them. But then, of course, Joshua and Caleb, they speak forth, and they say, we should go. But of course, the community decides they're not going to try to take the land. And then, of course, the people rebel. Chapter 14. And this is where they decide they're not going to go. Now we have another intercession of Moses here. The glory of the Lord. Let's see. And then they threaten to stone Joshua and Caleb. So they're about to get stoned for telling the people, "Don't rebel against the Lord. Do not fear the people. For protection is gone. The Lord is with us. Do not fear them." But all the congregation said to stone them. But while they were getting ready to stone them, the glory of the Lord appeared in the tent of meeting to the sons of Israel. And the Lord said to Moses, "How long will this people be disrespectful to me? How long will they not believe in me? Despite all the signs I perform in their midst, I will strike them with plague and dispossess them, and I will make you into a nation greater and mightier than they." So this is a repeat of what happened on Mount Sinai with the golden calf incident. And Moses prays similarly. Moses said to the Lord, "But the Egyptians will hear of it, for by your strength you brought this people up from their midst. And they will tell it to the inhabitants of the land. They have heard that you, Lord, are in the midst of the people, because you, Lord, are seen eye to eye while your cloud stands over them, and you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Now, if you put this people to death all at once, then the nations who have heard your fame will say, since the Lord could not bring this people into the land which he promised them by oath, he slaughtered them in the wilderness. So now please let the power of the Lord be great, just as you have declared, saying, the Lord is slow to anger and abundant in mercy, forgiving wrongdoing in violation of his law, but he will by no means leave the guilty unpunished, inflicting the punishment of the fathers to the children, to the third and the fourth generation. So that's interesting, right? So in Moses' intercession with the golden calf, he doesn't quote this, because where did he get this information? Well, it was later, after his intercession was successful, and he asked the Lord to see his glory, and he placed him in the cleft of the rock, and his glory passed before him. That's where that revelation was given. So Moses is reminding God of that revelation. He's slow to anger, abundant in mercy. But he doesn't leave out the part where it says he will not leave the guilty unpunished, right? So he's in the same idea, too, of, Lord, the nations will hear that you weren't able to bring your people into the promised land, so you slaughtered them instead. And what will that do to your reputation, to your honor? Then verse 19, Moses continues, please forgive the guilt of this people in accordance with the greatness of your mercy, just as you've also forgiven this people from Egypt until now. So the Lord said, so what's the Lord's response to this intercession of Moses? I have forgiven them in accordance with your word. However, as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord. Certainly all the people have seen my glory and my signs which I performed in Egypt and the wilderness, yet have put me to the test these 10 times, and have not listened to my voice, shall by no means see the land which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who were disrespectful to me see it. But as for my servant Caleb, because he had a different spirit and has followed me fully, I will bring him into the land which he entered, and his descendants shall take possession of it. Now the Amalekites and the Canaanites live in the valleys. Turn tomorrow and set out for the wilderness by the way of the Red Sea. So basically that's where and then the next section, he basically gives so the intercession is successful because God threatened to kill the entire nation again. So they're not going to die, but that doesn't mean God's not going to punish the guilty, as it said. So what he's going to do now is that generation will all die in the wilderness, except for Joshua and Caleb, for 40 years. So the punishment for you, for your guilt, a year that is 40 years, and you will know my opposition. I, the Lord, have spoken. I certainly will do this to this evil congregation who are gathered against me. They shall be worn out in this wilderness, and they shall die here. And then, of course, what happens is when the people hear this word, this judgment, they decide, no, we were wrong. We're going to go into the promised land, and they try to go in, and they get horribly defeated, and they have to run away from the enemies. And it also, I missed it, also the 10 spies get put to death as well by the Lord. Where was that? 10 spies get put to death. 10 spies who rebelled. It's somewhere in here. There it is. As for the men whom Moses sent to spy in the land, who returned and led the congregation to grumble against him by bringing a bad report about the land, these men that brought the bad report of the land also died by a plague in the presence of the Lord. But Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb remained alive. So the Lord put them to death immediately because of their role in their grumbling and complaining. So we still, we have the wrath of God aroused by the people's sin. We still see that theme just continuing to go through. And 16 just sets up for some different laws and sacrifices, intentional sin, etc., unintentional sin, Sabbath breaking. That's noted here, but we're going to skip past that. So now we're going to look at Korah's rebellion. So here we have another one of these instances. So now, chapter 16. Now Korah, son of Izhar, son of Kohath, son of Levi, with Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, on the son of Pelah, sons of Reuben, took men, and they stood before Moses together with some of the sons of Israel, 250 leaders, chosen in the assembly, men of renown. They assembled together against Moses and Aaron and said to them, "You have gone far enough. For all the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is in their midst. So why do you exalt yourself above the assembly of the Lord?" When Moses heard this, he fell on his face and spoke to Korah and all his group, saying, "Tomorrow morning the Lord will make known to you who is his, and who is holy, and will bring that one near to himself. Indeed, the one whom he will choose, he will bring near to himself. Do this, take censers for yourself, Korah and your whole group, and put fire in them, and place incense upon them in the presence of the Lord tomorrow. And the men whom the Lord chooses shall be the one who is holy. You have gone too far, you sons of Levi." So basically that's Moses saying, you're going to challenge me? we'll all stand in the presence of the Lord with our censers in hand and see who he chooses. And so they say, at first they reply, we're not going to come up, and then they end up deciding to come. So they each took his censer, put fire in it, and placed incense on it, and they stood at the entrance to the tent of meeting with Moses and Aaron. So these 250, they take their censers, 250 of them. So Korah assembled all the congregation against them at the entrance to the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord appeared to all the congregation. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, separate yourselves from among this congregation so that I may consume them instantly. But they fell on their faces and said, God, the God of the spirits of humanity, when one person sins, will you be angry with the entire congregation? So this is interesting. So God says he's going to destroy all 250 of these. But because of the intercession of Moses and Aaron, saying, don't put them all to death, just put the ringleader to death. So what's the Lord's response to that intercession? Then the Lord spoke to Moses, speaking to the congregation, saying, get away from the areas around the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Then Moses arose and went to Dathan and Abiram with the elders of Israel following him, and he spoke to the congregation, saying, get now away from the tents of these wicked men, and do not touch anything that belongs to them, or you will be swept away in all their sin. So they moved away from the areas around their tents. And Dathan and Abiram came out and stood at the entrance of their tents, along with their wives, their sons, and their little ones. And Moses said, by this you shall know the Lord has sent me to do all these deeds, for it is not my doing. If these men die the death of all mankind, or if they suffer the fate of all mankind, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord brings about an entirely new thing, and the ground opens his mouth and swallows them with everything that is theirs, as they descend alive into Sheol, then you will know that these men have been disrespectful to the Lord. So what happens? And he finished speaking all these words. The ground that was under them split open, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them, their households, and all the people who belonged to Korah with all their possessions. So they and all that belonged to them went down alive into Sheol, and the earth closed over them, and they perished from the midst of the assembly. Then all Israel who were around them fled at the outcry, for they said, the earth might swallow us. Fire also came out from the Lord and consumed the 250 men who were offering incense. Quite interesting, right? So the wrath of the Lord provoked again. And because of the intercession of Moses, and actually the intercession, I mean, God could have meant that he was going to destroy the entire nation again. When he said, get away from this congregation, I'm going to destroy them. Because he ends up killing the 250 who rebelled anyway. And of course, the Dathan and Abiram, they get swallowed alive. So we have this theme continuing. The wrath of God can break out when the people complain, when the people sin, when the people want to challenge the authority of his anointed leader, Moses. And then this is interesting. Look what the Lord tells Moses to do here. Tell Eleazar, son of Aaron, the priest, that he shall pick up the censers from the midst of the burned area, because they are holy. You are to scatter the burning coals farther away. As for the censers of these men who have sinned at the cost of their own lives, have made them into hammered sheets as plating for the altar. Since they did present them before the Lord as they are holy, then they shall serve as a sign of the sons of Israel. So that's quite interesting, right? So these censers are to be melted down and hammered into a covering for the altar. So every time a sacrifice is made now, hang on, let me, 1 second. Sorry about that. I had to take a look at the text. So now these censers are hammered, and they're now covering the altar as a reminder of this rebellion. Every time the Levites from this point on, and every time the people bring their sacrifice to the Levites, they're reminded of that rebellion. So a lot of the stuff God does is to for memory. Memory is a pretty important feature in these biblical texts. We should always remember the wrath of God poured out in the past. And it benefits us in the present to remember the judgment of God that was poured out for sin. And of course, Paul in 2 Corinthians, or it's 1 Corinthians chapter 10, tells us that this is exactly how we should think of these stories, as a reminder, an instruction to us. And he lists the sins of the Israelites and how they're instructed to us in 1 Corinthians 10. So that does carry over into the New Testament. Now I have another one here. But on the next day, all the congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron, saying, you are the ones who have caused the death of the Lord's people. So it's these people, it's like you see 250 people die, you see the ground swallow up an entire group of people, and you still have the nerve the next day to come at Moses again? I mean, geez. I mean, wouldn't you think you'd be like, okay, we should quit challenging Moses now. We saw, Miriam is leprous because of it, and now all these people died because of it, but let's do it again. It came about, however, when the congregation assembled against Moses and Aaron, that they turned toward the tent of meeting, and behold, the cloud covered it, and the glory of the Lord appeared. Then Moses and Aaron came to the front of the tent of meeting, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Get away from among this congregation, I may consume them instantly. Then they fell on their faces, and Moses said to Aaron, Take your censer and put fire in it from the altar, and place incense on it. Then bring it quickly to the congregation, and make atonement for them. For wrath has gone out from the Lord, the plague has begun. Okay, so now here's a very specific text that's important for our study of penal substitutionary atonement. So God's wrath is about to consume the entire congregation. And what Moses tells Aaron to do is take your censer, light it up, put incense on it, and make atonement for them. For wrath has gone out from the Lord, and the plague has begun. So I want you to notice this. The making of atonement outside of the sacrificial system is being shown to us here. Because you would assume making atonement only happens on the altar, right? And the great day of atonement that we saw last time. No. I think this is instructive for us. Because when we get to Jesus, his sacrifice did not happen in the temple. He was not sacrificed on the altar. You ever thought about that? Why wasn't Jesus, if he is truly a one-to-one type antitype with the sacrificial system of Israel, he should have been slaughtered on the altar and his blood taken into the Holy of Holies in the Jerusalem temple, but it wasn't. So I think we have a typology set up for this, where this atonement can happen outside the temple sacrifice. So it's the atonement is made here by the incense placed on the censer. So this plague, representing God's wrath, is killing people. Then Aaron took it just as Moses had spoken. He ran out in the midst of the assembly. Behold, the plague had begun among the people. So he put on the incense and made atonement for the people. And he took his stand between the dead and the living, so that the plague was brought to a halt. Now, I remember Charles Spurgeon has an amazing sermon on this text. I figure it's titled something along the lines of he's standing between the dead and the living, or the living and the dead. And by the way, Charles Spurgeon, if you're not aware of this, he preached a ton on penal substitutionary atonement. Like, if you want someone who's really going to get in depth with penal substitutionary atonement and talk about it as the heart of the gospel, Charles Spurgeon, man, tons of his sermons are on penal substitutionary atonement. Sorry about this cough. Jeez. So the plague was brought to a halt because he took his stand between the dead and the living. He made atonement with that incense. And it's interesting. It's called an atonement, but there's no blood sacrifice that happened. It's just the incense placed on the censer, right? So that's interesting. The atonement can transcend just the narrow, it's a sacrifice of an animal thing, which I think is also very interesting. But, so he stopped the plague, but those who died by the plague were 14,700 in number, beside those who died on the account of Korah. Then Aaron returned to Moses, the entrance tent of meeting, for the plague had been brought to a halt. So it was quite interesting, right? So where are we at? Got my little note cards here with my notes. Okay. Then we have chapter 17. I think for sake of time, because I want to just do numbers in one episode. We have another challenge. These people keep challenging the authority. It's unbelievable. And they're challenging. No, actually, this is just confirmation. No, this isn't because of a challenge. This is where God's going to give a sign that definitively shows the people that Levi is the one who's chosen. How they do this: each man brings a staff. I mean, it's a piece of dead wood. It's not connected to a tree. It's dead. But they put the staves before the Lord, and the next morning, Aaron's staff buds, and it not only buds, it actually grows full ripened almonds, which is supernatural because that takes a while for almonds to ripen. So and that's placed in the tent of meeting. Then the sons of Israel spoke to Moses, saying, Behold, we are passing away, we are all perishing. Everyone who comes near the tabernacle of the Lord must die, or are we to perish completely? So, the people are finally getting some fear of God in them, it sounds like, after all these incidents that have happened in these past several chapters. So we have the duties of the Levites, we have the red heifer. We don't have time to get into all this. The whole red heifer thing. A lot of dispensationalists are big on the red heifer. That's necessary for the end times and stuff like that. We don't have to get into all this. And then we have, where do we want to go here? 'Cause for sake of time, we're 45 minutes. Okay, the bronze snake. Okay, so the bronze snake, why is the bronze snake important? Well, the bronze snake is important because this is Jesus explicitly in John 3 wants us to see this as a type of what he's going to accomplish on the cross. So it's quite interesting. Let's read this little story. Then the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people. This is a response to their complaining. They were impatient. Why have you brought us from Egypt to die? There's no food and water. We're disgusted with the manna. They do that again. Then the Lord sent fiery serpents among them, and they bit the people. So many people of Israel died. So they're dying of snake bites. These are probably very venomous snakes. Kills you very quick. So the people came to Moses and said, "We have sinned because we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Intercede with the Lord that he will remove the serpents from us." And Moses interceded for the people. Now look what God instructs Moses to do in this case. So it's intercession. So when Jesus mentions this, I think many people forget that. We got to put in the context of Jesus saying he's being lifted up on the snake. He's talking about his intercession. This is a result of his intercession. The Lord said to Moses, "Make a fiery serpent, put it on a flagpole. It shall come about that everyone who is bitten and looks to it will live." So Moses made a bronze serpent, put it on the flagpole. And it came about that if a serpent bit someone and he looked at the bronze serpent, he lived. Quite interesting. So the bronze serpent, so it's been said, so you have the cause, the representation of the wrath of God that's coming against sin is the serpent. The serpents are sent by God to bite the people and kill them. But then the solution to that is also a serpent, and it's placed on a pole and lifted up, and everyone who looks to it will live. So the very thing that is the cause of death becomes the cause of the salvation from death. And I really think Jesus makes this an image because he's really wanting us to see his death on the cross, being lifted up the cross. And it reminds me of Paul's, "He made him who knew no sin to be sin for us." So the very cause of our death is our sin. The reason why the wrath of God comes against us is because of our sin against him. Jesus takes upon himself our sin so that the wrath of God falls upon him instead. So I think this is a very important story to understand the atonement and that Jesus is suffering the curse and being treated as a sinner. Okay, so then we're almost done here. Hopefully my voice holds up here. Let me get another cough drop. Cough drops seem to help a little bit with this, although I talk weird when I have the full one in. Okay. Now, where do we want to go next? Let's just go right to 25, because this is where this story here is very important for the understanding of penal substitutionary atonement. Now, we're skipping over a pretty, 22, 23, and 24, where the king of Moab tries to get Balaam to curse Israel, and of course it doesn't work. He can only bless them, and he bribes he bribes Balaam with money, and he tries to curse them, but he can't curse them. And read that whole story. But I've always said this. I used to say this at Teen Challenge all the time. So, the Moabite king is trying to, because he's afraid of Israel. He wants to destroy them. They're a military threat to him. So he tries to have them curse, and it doesn't work. Well, when that fails, when cursing fails, guess what all you need to do? Just send in the prostitutes. just send in the women. That'll do the trick for you. When a curse doesn't work, just send in the women, and that'll do everything you need done. So 25, when Israel remained at Shittim, the people began to commit infidelity with the daughters of Moab. For they invited the people to sacrifice of their gods, and the peoples ate and bowed down to their gods. Now, it doesn't say that the king of Moab actually sent the women in, but that's what I like to think happened. Who knows how the women got in there, or how they started intermingling with them, but they started to mess around with the women, the daughters of Moab, who were idolaters. And They bowed down to their gods. So Israel became followers of the Baal of Peor, and the Lord was angry with Israel. And the Lord said to Moses, take the leaders of the people and execute them in broad daylight before the Lord, so that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. So Moses said to the judges of Israel, each of you kill his men who have become followers of the Baal of Peor. So, of course, the Lord's anger is coming. And the solution to this anger, the fierce anger of the Lord, is to execute those who were the ringleaders in this rebellion against him to worship the Baal of Peor. Now, here's what we want to see. This is important. If you haven't paid, if you're still listening, faithful listener, 15 minutes in, thank you. But you really want to pay attention here. So check this out, and we'll be done when we do this. Then behold, one of the sons of Israel came and brought to his relatives a Midianite woman in the sight of Moses and in the sight of the whole congregation of the sons of Israel. Well, they were sweeping at the entrance of the tent of meeting. So this one guy, he just flagrantly walks in the camp. And he's like, check out my side chick. Got this Midianite woman, brought her in. Let's go. And Moses and the whole congregation are weeping because of the wrath of God is coming out, and people are getting killed, and this idolatry is happening. It's bringing all this misery. And he just waltzes right by. Like, not a big deal. Like, just flagrant rebellion. He's not even doing it in secret. Now look what it says. When Phineas, this guy Phineas, a Levite, he's a son of Aaron. He's a grandson of Aaron. He's a son of Eleazar, grandson of Aaron. When he saw this guy waltzing in with this woman, what's he do? He rose up from the midst of the congregation, took a spear in his hand. And he went after the man of Israel into the inner room of the tent and pierced both of them, the man of Israel and the woman through the abdomen. So you can read between the lines. It sounds like they were getting it on. And he just, with one spear thrust, goes through the man's back and through the woman's belly. Because it doesn't necessarily say they were having sex when this happened, but it's implied. So he kills them both with that spear. Now look what it says. So the plagues on the son of Israel was brought to a halt. But those who died from the plague were 24,000. But the plague was stopped. The plague was stopped why? By Phinehas' actions. By Phinehas' actions of slaughtering this Israelite man and the Midianite woman. Now look at the interpretation of this from the Lord. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has averted my wrath from the sons of Israel in that he was jealous with my jealousy among them, so that I did not destroy the sons of Israel in my jealousy. Therefore say, behold, I am giving him my covenant of peace, and it shall be for him and for his descendants after him, a covenant of a permanent priesthood, because he was jealous for his God, and listen to it, and made atonement for the sons of Israel. So, it's been implied. I mean, we've seen the wrath of God averted by the killing of the guilty and in various different ways. And we've seen this term made atonement used in various different ways, but this is the first time you have atonement being made by the actual death of a person who sinned. And you have the priest holding the weapon of that death. And when the priest takes that action, it is actually called the making of atonement. Do you see that? And we go all the way back to Genesis. We talked about this. It's a thread that you can't miss, where the Levites are cursed by Jacob because of the cruelty of their sword when they slaughter the Shechemites for violating their daughter or their sister. And then you have in Exodus, where the Israelites strap their swords on their side and they go through the camp and kill after the golden calf. And they're ordained to the service of the Lord because of that event. Now here you have a Levite, Phinehas, taking the spear, the weapon of death, putting this Israelite man and this Midianite woman to death, and it is said that that act was made atonement for the sons of Israel. Why is this important? Because we have to have some context a priest. The putting to death of Jesus was done by the hands of wicked men, but his death was counted as an atonement. We haven't seen human sacrifice called an atonement until this point. Now we have a human sacrifice done by a Levite called making of atonement. This is penal substitutionary atonement and the framework for it. The wrath of God placed in the weapon of Phinehas as he slaughters the sinners and makes atonement for Israel. And when we get to Jesus of Nazareth, you have the Jews, the Gentiles, Pilate, all responsible for putting Jesus to death. But that human sacrifice of the Son of God is said to make atonement for his people. Amazing. And then, of course, I guess we have time to switch to it because we're done there. I just wanted to point out the typology of Joshua taking over leadership. Joshua takes over leadership from Moses. And, of course, Jesus' Hebrew name is Joshua, Yeshua. And just the same way that Joshua, now there's some translation things with Joshua 1:6. Does it say Joshua will cause them to enter the land or just he will distribute the land? But the bottom line is, if you read the book of Joshua, you'll see Joshua's obedience to the Lord is what brings the people into the promised land. And what we're going to see is that's a type. Jesus, by his obedience, brings us into the promised land as the true fulfillment of the successor of Moses, the one greater than Moses, the one who is the true Joshua, who by his obedience takes us into the promised land. And then, of course, Psalm, because Phinehas is mentioned again, if you're not aware of this. Psalm, P-S-A-L-M, Psalm 106:28. And it's interesting. So there, full chapter. So, and actually, Psalm 106 is a fitting psalm to check out because it's basically in one psalm reflecting on everything we just went over. Basically, the golden calf and Dathan and all this stuff, complaining about the food. But so it's a good, Psalm 109 is just a history lesson of all the rebellion of the children of Israel in the book of Exodus and Numbers. But then we have, so this is Psalm 106:28. They also followed Baal Peor and ate sacrifices offered to the dead. So they provoked him to anger with their deeds, and a plague broke out among them. Then Phinehas stood up and intervened, and so the plague was brought to a halt, and it was credited to him as righteousness to all generations forever. And I found that interesting. So in Numbers, it says he made an atonement. In Psalm 106, it says it was credited to him as righteousness. It's almost like Phinehas encompasses both aspects of the work of Christ, right? His active obedience, which is his obedience in our place that's credited to us by faith, and his passive obedience, which that comes from the term passion, his obedience of suffering, where he suffers the wrath we deserve on the cross to make atonement for us. And it's like these two things come together in Numbers and the Psalm 106 in the person of Phinehas, the atonement language and the credited as righteousness language. I thought that was pretty cool. So there it is. Book of Numbers. So we will continue. We'll take a peek at Deuteronomy. And then from there, I'm not sure where I'm going yet. I'm still trying to formulate it. There's a couple other significant places in the Old Testament that we need to look before we hit the New Testament to see the biblical theology of penal substitutionary atonement. So thank you so much for joining me for another episode. Like, subscribe, share, all that good stuff. And I will see you next time. Thank you, and God bless.